Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, I'll be talking with Brittany Michalski of Climate Stewards USA. The aim of Climate Stewards is to make the world a healthier, fairer place for all creation. They do this by helping individuals and communities to become more aware of the planet-warming carbon emissions that they produce in their day-to-day activities. They also provide opportunities for people to essentially make up for their harmful carbon emissions by putting money towards carbon-reducing projects around the world. Projects that improve the lives of communities in less developed countries. Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Well, welcome, Brittany. I'm wondering if you could help our listeners to understand your primary work role these days and what you're committed to.
Yeah, of course. It's great to be with you, Forrest. So I am the project coordinator for Climate Stewards USA. Basically, I'm working to expand the work of Climate Stewards here in the U.S. and help folks connect with the services that we offer.
For those who aren't familiar with the work of Climate Stewards, perhaps you could give us a 101 about what carbon offsetting is. Now, I'll note that last year we did actually interview Caroline Pomeroy from the UK version of your organization. So we did actually learn quite a lot, but maybe you could, for listeners who aren't so familiar with carbon offsetting, explain what is involved in that. How does that work?
So if you were going to buy a t-shirt, the cost of that includes the materials and the labor and some profit for the company. But what's not probably included in that cost is, say, if there was some pollution at the factory where it was made, that pollution is perhaps affecting the factory workers and the environment. That pollution is considered an externality because it's not included in the cost of the t-shirt. Similarly, as we go about our lives, there's a carbon cost to our lifestyle, particularly in Western societies. And that carbon is an externality. It's not accounted for in the gas that we pump at the gas station or the food that we eat. So carbon offsetting is a way to account for those costs and to bring them into account, to be able to balance them out, as some people would say, or to compensate for those costs. So really, carbon offsetting is a way of trying to do the right thing by the unfortunate and inevitable harm that our lives cause, even though we're not trying to.
So then enter Climate Stewards, of course. What does your organization then do to help people to make that balance more even?
A carbon footprint is basically the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that are emitted into the atmosphere through your life activities. So the largest component for many is the energy that they use to heat and cool their home and run their appliances. But travel is another big one. So that's your commuting and running to the grocery store, and of course your flights as well. There's also the food that you eat, the waste that you generate, the water that you use, and the things that you buy. There are carbon costs associated with all of these things. Some of them, it's really obvious because we're actually burning fossil fuels. So when I fill up the tank of my car and drive it, I'm burning gas and oil. Hopefully not too much oil. That would be bad, but that's very direct. But then there are also carbon emissions associated with the supply chain. So that's where there are carbon emissions associated with the services that we use and the things that we buy. So we have a carbon calculator online on our website that people can put in their information. For example, if folks wanted to look at the carbon footprint of their house for an entire year, you could do that. Or if you just wanted to calculate how much carbon was emitted for a vacation flight, you could do that as well. And then once you've calculated the carbon footprint, there's an opportunity to offset as well. But the carbon calculators that we have online are for individuals, and then we have 360 Carbon, which is for churches. We also offer a consultancy service for larger organizations because there's a lot of data involved, and it would be very cumbersome for those organizations to try and deal with it. And so we deal with it for them and then provide a carbon footprint report for them.
And of course, this tool helps us to become more aware for two reasons. On the one hand, when you see exactly what amount of carbon you're emitting in your life through various activities, that translates into offsetting, which, when it comes right down to it, is about money, right? People are donating money or paying money to the organization, which then gets reapplied elsewhere in ways that balance out that carbon emission. But I'll have to say from experience, using that carbon calculator, it also really drove me to see my life in a new way. There are things you do that you don't really realize sometimes have an impact. And so I think that's one really, really good function of the carbon footprint calculator, is helping us to realize that there's many things in our lives that not only are part of the problem, but that we can actually change. There are things we can do. It's not just about maybe driving less or getting an electric car. It's about buying certain kinds of foods over other foods, which are more carbon intensive. So decisions that we're not really used to thinking about in terms of carbon footprint.
Yeah. Was there anything in particular that startled you and resulted in you changing a habit?
Well, we have a lot of people on the podcast. When I ask them, what can people do to begin their journey into earth keeping, a lot of them will say, plant a tomato. You know, it's sort of this symbolic act of so many different things. On the one hand, it's connecting you more to nature. On the other, it's about finding ways to avoid buying produce that is shipped across the country that costs so much in terms of carbon emissions because of the transport costs. So I would say that really food has been my big learning curve, my big revelation over the last couple of years. And it's actually caused me to become much more of a vegetable gardener. I'm still learning about those things, but it's made me prioritize at least the efforts to grow some more of my produce, because I don't think I realized I had actually put it together, that the ways we eat, especially in the West, they tend to be very carbon intensive and carbon costly. So maybe that was my biggest takeaway from learning from people like you on the podcast.
Well, Forrest, I will have to send you some seeds from a tomato plant that is native to the Everglades that I have. I got...
Really?
Yeah. While I was visiting colleagues in Florida, they're very, very, very small, like the size of a dime, these tomatoes. I took one home and I saved the seeds and I gave some to my mom and I kept some for myself. And I'm growing 2 of them this year, and they are growing faster and taller than any of my other tomato plants. And I'm in Wisconsin, and they love it here, but I'll have to send you some of these native Florida Everglades tomato seeds, and you can see how they work out there.
Yeah, I would love that. I would love that. It's become kind of a weird hobby to find the strangest tomatoes I can grow. And if I can grow native Florida tomatoes that are the size of a dime, I would love that. That'd be great. Yeah. My latest experiment is black tomatoes, which are really beautiful, but I can't get anyone to eat them.
I would eat them.
So, yeah. But yeah, I appreciate that offer. Thank you.
We work with partners in the global south to develop projects that will save carbon. Our first project was in Ghana in partnership with Rocha, Ghana, to plant a forest at a school. And so we calculate the amount of carbon that will be saved or stored by those trees. And then people can donate, say, the carbon cost of a plane flight from New York to Dallas. And so they can calculate that amount through our carbon calculator and then offset that amount. So effectively, with our offsets, we are planting trees in Ghana and investing in sustainable technologies as well. So some of our other projects include biosand water filters, which are a no-cost solution to folks who don't have access to clean water. Rather than boiling the water over charcoal or firewood, the biosand water filter provides clean water without having to boil, and so we save carbon in that process. There's also clean cook stoves and fireless cookers, which all are reducing the need to burn fuel.
So I imagine that if one lives in poverty, thinking about one's carbon footprint or thinking about the amount of carbon you're emitting is not a major issue, right? You think about other things first. So when, for example, you go to Ghana and perhaps teach people about the sand filters for the water, what induces them to use such things or to say use clean cooking stoves?
That's a great question. Our partners are part of the community. So there's not somebody coming in from the outside and telling this community that you should use this new thing. That's been done and tried before by many others. And what happens is that those things are discarded and not used. So one of our distinctives is that our partners are part of the community. And the folks, for example, who are receiving a biosand water filter, it doesn't just show up on their doorstep one day. They are involved in the entire process of construction and of learning how it works, how to fix it, and where they can go for help if something goes wrong, if it stops working for some reason. We also employ, in the case of the biosand water filters, filter buddies. So these are folks in the community whose role is to go around and to visit the homes of those with biosand water filters to ensure that they're working properly and that the households are actually using them.
And of course, I imagine that there's some actual benefits that come with it that go even beyond carbon emission. I'll just guess at this. You can confirm for me. I imagine if you are learning how to use biosand water filters, what that probably does is makes it quicker in some ways to get water. Like boiling the water seems like it would be an arduous process. Are there benefits like that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The biosand water filters are a great example. We can see with the biosand water filters that people are seeing multiple benefits. There's, as you mentioned, the time resource that is more available with the filters. And also, people drink more water. And so there's health benefits in that way, reduced smoke and eye and lung diseases that go along with burning fires indoors or being around fires a lot. We also see an indirect benefit to local forests because the pressure for firewood and charcoal is reduced. So we see this wide range of benefits, everything from biodiversity to finances. It costs money to purchase charcoal, and that's one of the reasons that people continue to use them, is that it really does help them.
I really like what you said about these other benefits, such as benefits to the forest, and that people are no longer needed to cut the trees down at the same rate. It reminds me actually of something that's concerned me in the last 4 or 5 years. I'm in the field of community development, and community developers tend to focus on human need, what's best for the community, what's best for community health, for example. And sometimes we prioritize human need over the need of the broader community, including creation. So for me, the thing that's really had to be expanded is this definition I hold of what is community and who is part of community. And it seems to me that when you're counting the benefits of these various interventions like the clean cook stoves, you are taking a much more holistic approach to understanding what community is. It isn't just about people's needs, it's about the needs of their environment as well. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, for sure. And I wonder, from your perspective, what is a way to begin that conversation within the community development realm?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a lot easier to have that conversation with people who are experiencing various needs, people in the context who probably know very well how interconnected their community is with the environment. I do think it tends to be folks from outside the country who want to do good, maybe coming from a Western context, who are more concerned with efficiencies and perhaps have the over-prioritization of human need in mind when they're actually helping to implement projects and provide resources. So I would say one really important way would be to involve the people who live in the villages and ask them, how can we do this? What do we need to think about? Who do we need to think about? What elements of community? Because I think they have a lot to teach us. And very often, people who intervene from the outside tend not to listen because they're pretty assured of their expertise and of the effectiveness of their solutions that they import. Climate Stewards probably has seen what happens when we don't listen, because we can end up with irrelevant or unsustainable projects and interventions that people really don't own because the ideas didn't come from them. It didn't rely on their local knowledge, their local wisdom.
Yes, that's definitely true.
We've been in conversation with Brittany Michalski of Climate Stewards USA. As we've noted, Climate Stewards collects the money paid for carbon offsetting in the global north and invests it in ways that both balance global carbon emissions and make life better for rural folks in the global south. In effect, they are supporting the work of community development through an organization called Rocha International, an organization that works for healthy ecologies in ways that also improve people's lives. As you might have picked up by now, I have a particular passion for these sorts of issues, and 15 years ago, founded a master's degree program in international community development at Northwest University in Kirkland, Washington. As the title suggests, the aim of that program is to equip people for service and advocacy all over the world. One of the distinctives of the ICD program is its holistic definition of community that includes not just people, but also focuses on ecologies where those people live. That is the broader community of creation. If you know someone who might be interested in this master's program, which is offered either online or in person, check out the show notes or just do an internet search for International Community Development at Northwest University. And now back to our conversation with Brittany Michalski. I am wondering why. Why should people consider offsetting as part of a larger strategy for earthkeeping? And I'm wondering too, this is a corollary question that has come up for me recently, is offsetting something that individuals can do effectively, or is it really meant for large organizations?
I've gotten that question too, and I've thought a lot about it. We have, as a team, have thought a lot about it. And the answer is, at least from my perspective, yes, both individuals and large organizations can offset and do so meaningfully. So, and I'm going to forget the name of the author, but the name of the book is Under the Skies We Make. The author really goes into depth about how individuals can make a difference. And one of the reasons we can, particularly thinking of individuals in the West, is that the world's richest 10% are responsible for 50% of global emissions. If you make $40,000 a year or more, you are in that top 10%. So that's a fair number of Americans. And one of the largest expenditures of carbon is flights. So I think in particular for individuals to offset their flights, that is meaningful. But taking a step back, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is, when is it appropriate to offset? And in this way, there's a cool analogy that Climate Stewards has blogged about, is carbon offsets are like ice cream. You don't get to offset until you've eaten your veggies, also known as you have taken the steps to reduce your carbon footprint. So that is a really key component of carbon offsetting, whether you're an individual or a large corporation, because if we aren't reducing our emissions, we're not actually making progress on ultimately stopping climate change and addressing the issues that have created the situation in the first place, which is primarily our use of fossil fuels.
That's such a good point, because I think if people can find a way to excuse their bad behavior, then they keep on doing that bad behavior, just maybe assuaging their guilt a bit because they know they've paid a price for it. And of course, there are many people who can pay the price and probably don't think much of it. So I like the fact that you're talking about personal responsibility for change as well. It's not just about balancing, it's also about changing.
It's good for individuals to take action, whether that's carbon offsetting or to focus on talking about climate change and talking about the reasons for caring and for acting, even though there are people and organizations and companies that are responsible for the lion's share of the problem. We need not completely disregard individual action while we shake our fists at these larger entities.
Yeah, again, because that could be really a way out for us of taking responsibility for our own actions if we were always pointing to the larger offenders in terms of climate impact. I wonder, though, is it possible that individuals could somehow think about carbon offsetting in a community way? What I mean by that is that oftentimes when we try to do hard things or big things, it can be easier when we're doing it with other people who have the same goals, because you're doing it with people of like mind, like heart, who can support you in what you're doing, especially when it gets hard. Is that kind of idealistic thinking, or have you seen people do that to take a more community-oriented approach to changing behavior?
I see it happening at the church level. So we offer a carbon tool for churches called 360 Carbon, and it's fairly new in the US. It's been in use in the UK for a couple of years now, and there's more than 700 churches who are using it to track and reduce their carbon footprint. But church, at the end of the day, is people. It's not necessarily a building. In the context of calculating a carbon footprint, the building is important, but it's a community effort to bring together all of the necessary data to understand what is our church's carbon footprint: electricity, travel, expenditure, all of these different components. And so within that context, then there's also the opportunity for folks to look at the other 6 days of the week. And so we're starting to see that here in the US. There's a number of churches who are beginning to use this tool, and I'm walking alongside of them as they begin that journey. But I'm also seeing a lot of people beginning to offset as individuals because they read a book. And that is Saving Us by Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. When I contact them to thank them for their offset donation and ask them how they heard about us, many of them cite reading her book as the reason.
It's interesting that you bring up Katharine Hayhoe, because as we've been talking, I've been thinking about her. And that's what's happened since we had her on the podcast. And I think one of the most impactful things that she said, and I believe she drew this from her book, was this idea that one individual can't push a boulder up the hill. But the more people you have pushing a massive boulder up the hill, the quicker it's going to go, the easier it will be. And then she talks about getting to the top of the hill and rolling it down the other side, like once there's momentum. And I think there's something really powerful about that. And because of that conversation, that particular metaphor has actually become part of our conversation as a reference point when we talk about what can we do together versus what can we accomplish just as individuals without thinking about others around us. So yeah, I'm with you there in terms of seeing her influence, definitely. You've talked about churches, and I love that fact that churches are finding ways to really do this together, to be in this together and to help each other, to enact environmental justice, really. Does this apply only to churches, though? Because I'm thinking of some mosques in the area where I live and wondering what would happen if they came to you and said, could you teach us about how as a community we might look more carefully at our carbon offsetting and change our behavior?
That's very true. Yeah, I think any organization, again, the externality, the reality of harmful carbon emissions happening because of living in the United States, for example, for those listeners, including myself, that are in the US, we all in some ways bear responsibility for that. And so addressing it as a community, whether it's a Christian community or Jewish community or Muslim community, is, I think, really awesome. And we are working on right now a synagogues version of our tool. And I think in time we will also have a tool component for mosques as well. It's a bit of a process, right? Because there's contextualization that's necessary. But yeah, I think even the church's tool right now could be used for a mosque in the US. Or the 360 Carbon tool also has options for small businesses and small nonprofits. So it's a fairly flexible sort of thing that if somebody from a mosque came to me today, I would still be able to point them to 360 Carbon and it may still be helpful to them.
What I love about you moving in that direction is it reminds me actually of some of the conversations I've had recently of people who are from multiple faiths coming together to try to work together to solve climate problems. And I just find that so inspiring, in part because it again represents a different sort of community, a necessary kind of community. But in the conversations I've had, there were a number of organizations in Bellingham I spoke to all at once from different faith perspectives. And the learning that happened in that conversation was just so energizing, because when people come from different traditions and different cultural backgrounds, they have new perspective, or at least new perspective to us if we're not in that particular context. And I think together we can only be better. Together we can actually help each other to understand and see things in new ways. So I'm glad that you're already thinking about moving in that direction.
What was the most surprising thing you learned?
I think what was interesting to me is that the particular group that I spoke to, they had somehow found ways to not be defensive against each other, because, religion tends to pit people against one another. And people from other traditions tend to, for some people, represent a threat in some ways. But for the particular group that I had talked to, they were just so winsome and trusting of one another. It was clear that they'd become friends as well. Not good friends, they didn't know each other that well, but their organizations had partnered together in the town of Bellingham, Washington, to do some pretty amazing things. And so I just admired so much their willingness to trust one another and to learn from one another. It was the humility that they showed was just so impressive. They knew they had a lot to learn. And when you have that stance, I think anything is possible in terms of community, when you value the perspective of the other person to give you what you don't have, to help you understand what you don't already.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some people have maybe got a bad impression of carbon offsetting because every once in a while you hear stories of carbon offsetting being more of a scheme or a scam. They'll take your money, they'll tell you how much you owe for the carbon that you've emitted, but that money may not actually be invested in the best ways. Perhaps a big proportion of it goes to overhead and administrative costs, or perhaps what a particular organization is calling carbon offsetting is actually not really that good for the earth. Maybe they're planting a eucalyptus crop to be harvested. Yes, you're planting trees, but you're not creating a balanced ecology. You're just creating profit for someone else. So you get these stories that kind of make you doubt. It's like, well, how can I know who to trust in terms of carbon offsetting? And it does make me ask the question, in terms of Climate Stewards, what is different about your approach? How can people know that what you're doing actually is good for the planet in the long run with the money they spend for offsetting?
What makes us different is that we have a direct relationship with our project partners, and many of them are Rocha organizations themselves. Rocha Ghana, Rocha Peru, Rocha Kenya. and we don't have a middleman between us. So many offsetting outfits, you're purchasing carbon offsets, but that company doesn't have a direct relationship with the partners. The folks on the ground who are generating the offsets, there's a middleman in between. And that's not the case with us. We know our project partners. I believe they're all faith-based as well, whether it's in Nepal with our partnership with RIDS Nepal, or in Tanzania where we're partnering with churches. There's some integrity that people can count on there in terms of we know our partners and we are in regular contact with our project partners. They're reporting to us the status of the trees that they're planting, or the biosand water filters, or the clean cook stoves that they are constructing and distributing in the community. In addition, the offset that folks pay, that money, actually includes a lot of buffer and a lot of risk assessment. And so the cost for our carbon is higher than some others that you could find. We pride ourselves on being conservative in terms of really trying to account for the things that could go wrong, the things that definitely do go wrong. A drought strikes and some of the tree seedlings die. Those tree seedlings need to be replaced in order for us to be able to guarantee that the carbon offsets will happen. Ultimately, even the price that we are charging is probably far below the real cost of carbon in the atmosphere. And so that's kind of in a nutshell what I would say makes us different is our relationships with partners and the robustness built into those carbon offset costs.
So it's clear that there's a lot of internal organizational transparency. Is there transparency from the outside as well? Can anyone go to Climate Stewards and find out some of this information? Like, where is the money going? Is that made public?
Yes. Our annual reports every year break down how much money is being spent on different categories, different projects, as well as things like overhead administration and that sort of thing. We are a nonprofit, so we're not looking to make profit in that way. We're not a for-profit company. There are for-profit offsetting companies, and more power to them, but that's not us.
So when you think about your deepest aspirations in terms of earth care, how do you most want your life to count? When you think about the times when you're really full of purpose and excited about what you're doing and in the flow of what you're made for, what does that look like?
For me, that looks like seeing life lived out in an interconnected way, for folks to be living out the connections of their vocation, their work, their faith with caring for God's creation, that the different issues that preoccupy us, they aren't separate from one another, but are actually connected in deep and purposeful ways. One of the times I experienced this most deeply was when I was finishing up my master's degree. I had a project in the Peruvian Amazon, working within remote indigenous tribes in the Peruvian Amazon, and I was conducting an ecological assessment for some land that they were taking care of. My guides were two indigenous Christian men. One had previously been a logger, the other was a pastor and a farmer, and we got to go out to the rainforest multiple times a week and just learn from one another and share together in this experience. On my side, looking from a scientific perspective at the land and its inhabitants, and them bringing their own life history, living in this place, but also their culture and the way that they view the land. And it was a very challenging and beautiful time of trying to reconcile these different streams of living into an interconnected whole.
What is it that drives you to work for the health of the planet? What is your why in all of this?
I wonder if you've ever seen common loons getting together in the middle of a lake and having a party.
Yes, I have seen that. Right. It's quite noisy at times.
It is noisy and amazing and mysterious. Like, what are they doing out there? What are they saying to one another? I think that God's world is full of mystery that it doesn't make sense to us humans. And I want to know more. I want to see what else there is that is a mystery, because so much of nature we just don't understand. And that is a reflection of God. So that's part of what drives me, is just the beauty and the mystery of this world that we find ourselves in.
We've been in conversation with Brittany Michalski of Climate Stewards. If you want to access the resources that Brittany referred to throughout the podcast, including the carbon calculator tools for individuals or communities, you'll find information and links on the podcast website. Also, if you missed those Earthkeepers podcast episodes that we referred to in our conversation, just go to the podcast website and look for episode 53, called Better Together, the Multi-Faith Network for Climate Justice, episode 41, an interview with Katharine Hayhoe on her book Saving Us, and episode 31, called Carbon Offsetting 101, which is an interview with Caroline Pomeroy of Climate Stewards UK. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Timothy Connor is our editor, and Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.